We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
4 minutes ago, a private message reached King Charles and transformed an already fragile royal dispute into a deeply personal confrontation. Meghan had not simply requested permission to return to royal life. She had presented herself under a title connected to Princess Diana, a title the palace had deliberately prohibited from being used by anyone else. Charles read the wording twice, placed the message on the table, and demanded to know who had allowed it to reach the palace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles felt the anger rise before anyone dared to speak. Meghan had spent years outside the working monarchy, yet every suggestion of a return unsettled the royal family. A working royal is a family member who performs duties on behalf of the crown, and she was now asking to step back toward that world on terms that reopened old wounds. The king looked again at the phrase near the top of the request, Diana's royal successor. That ceremonial description had been privately forbidden because it suggested that one woman could inherit Diana's public identity, emotional place, and influence. To him, the wording did not merely challenge palace protocol. It turned a dead woman's memory into pressure during a negotiation over status, access, protection, and power. Meghan's proposal went beyond a symbolic gesture. She wanted entry to Windsor, a place used for royal residence, ceremony, and family business. She also asked for a public appearance beside family members, restored security arrangements, and recognition as the natural continuation of Diana's humanitarian mission. Each demand carried risk, but together they formed something more dangerous, a route back into royal life built around the one name the monarchy could never treat casually. Charles stood beside the long table and read the page in silence. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the message, and fixed his attention on the waiting aide. "That title will not enter this family," he said. His voice was quiet. The decision was absolute. The monarch ordered palace officials to trace every hand that had touched the request. He wanted to know whether Harry had approved the language, whether Meghan had acted alone, and whether someone inside the royal household, the staff and offices supporting the sovereign, had encouraged her. The possibility of internal help changed the mood at once. Before any response could be drafted, William received the exact wording. He read the forbidden title, closed the file, and asked to speak to his father immediately. Charles had rejected the words as a monarch, but William was about to confront them as Diana's son. Behind the forbidden title were 3 people carrying 3 very different versions of the same history. Charles remembered a marriage that had ended in pain and public judgment. William guarded the memory of a mother whose name had followed him through every stage of his life. Meghan saw Diana as a symbol of independence, rejection, and survival. When those interpretations collided, the argument was no longer about a return to royal duties. It was about ownership of memory. Charles felt the past pressing against the authority he now carried. His relationship with Diana remained one of the most painful chapters in the monarchy's modern history, because every mention of her reopened questions about love, betrayal, responsibility, and regret. The monarchy was not merely a family. It was the institution led by the sovereign and supported by working relatives. Meghan's use of the forbidden title therefore threatened both the king's private emotions and the public order he was expected to protect. Meghan understood the comparison differently. She believed that she and Diana had both entered royal life with hope, only to face isolation, hostile headlines, and pressure from traditions that allowed little room for personal freedom. To her, the title was not theft, it was recognition. Yet Charles heard something colder inside those words. He heard an attempt to turn suffering into authority, and memory into a bargaining tool. William received the wording while preparing for a scheduled meeting. He reached the phrase, "Diana's royal successor," and his expression changed at once. The prince dismissed the waiting aide, closed the folder, and remained alone for several minutes. For him, this was not about palace rules. It was an intrusion into his mother's identity. He believed her legacy belonged neither to Meghan nor to the institution, and he would not allow anyone to use it as a path back to royal power. Harry stood in the most dangerous position of all. He understood why his wife compared herself to Diana, because he had watched Meghan struggle under the same kind of public pressure that once surrounded his mother. But he also knew how deeply William reacted whenever her name became part of a campaign. The younger brother feared that defending his wife could now be seen as betraying the woman both sons had spent their lives protecting. Camilla watched Charles grow more defensive and quietly warned him against acting too quickly. The Queen Consort told the king during a private conversation that a harsh rejection could transform Meghan's forbidden title into a symbol of resistance. He listened, but his anger did not fade. William was already preparing his own response, and Meghan had no idea that both men were moving toward the same boundary. The forbidden words had not appeared without warning. They had been born during an earlier palace confrontation, where one sentence changed everything and turned private resentment into a royal crisis. The title that enraged Charles had first been spoken months earlier, far from cameras and public ceremonies. It happened during a private planning meeting for a Diana Memorial initiative at Kensington Palace. Meghan had expected her proposal to be welcomed as an act of reconciliation. Instead, she was told that she would never be permitted to represent Diana's legacy in an official royal capacity. The refusal was calm, brief, and devastating, and it became the trigger for everything that followed. Meghan entered the discussion convinced that her idea would be difficult to reject. A memorial initiative was a limited royal program created to support causes linked to a deceased family member, and this one focused on homelessness, mental health, and vulnerable children. She believed those causes matched the humanitarian work she and Harry had already pursued. To her, participation was not a demand for power. It was a chance to return through service. William understood the proposal very differently. He knew Diana's name could draw attention, donations, and public sympathy, but he also knew how easily that influence could be turned into a personal claim. The prince feared that once one person was presented as the continuation of his mother, her memory would stop being a legacy and become a position that others could compete to inherit. The closed meeting reached its point of no return when a senior courtier began reading Meghan's written proposal. The official described her as a possible, modern continuation of Diana's compassionate mission. Before the sentence was finished, William placed one hand flat on the table and stopped him. His voice remained controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. "No living member of this family will be presented as her successor," he said. "Not Meghan, not Catherine, not even her sons." Meghan felt the rejection land with more force than anyone in the room understood. She believed the palace was willing to use Diana's image, while refusing to let anyone challenge its control over her story. William believed he had just protected his mother from being turned into a royal role that could be awarded, marketed, inherited, or claimed. Neither moved closer to the other. The silence hardened around them. Harry heard Meghan's anger later in a private recorded conversation preserved in their personal account of the meeting. She told him the palace feared her connection with Diana because the comparison gave her influence that did not depend on royal approval. He listened, troubled by her pain, but equally aware of why his brother had drawn the line. Charles acted soon afterward. The king approved a written restriction banning phrases such as Diana's successor, Diana's heir, and the new Diana from official negotiations, invitations, ceremonial descriptions, or royal programs. The instruction was clear, private, and final. Meghan had now used the exact phrase the monarch prohibited. What began as a rejected proposal was about to become a face-to-face battle over memory, authority, and the boundary she refused to accept. The confrontation took place without cameras, ceremonial uniforms, or prepared speeches. Meghan entered believing she could force the palace to discuss her return. Charles entered determined to end the conversation before the forbidden title gained legitimacy. Between them sat a single printed request containing Diana's name. For several minutes, neither touched it. Then Charles pushed the page across the table and asked Meghan to explain why she had used a title he had personally forbidden. Meghan had secured only a restricted private meeting, after insisting that her request concerned family reconciliation, not the permanent restoration of royal status. A restricted meeting meant the conversation was tightly controlled, with no public ceremony and no promise of official duties. She believed that distinction gave her room to negotiate. Charles believed it removed every excuse. The king agreed to hear her because he wanted the truth directly. Was the title a calculated demand, or had Meghan used it as an emotional description without understanding what it meant? She did not hesitate. She told him the phrase reflected survival, courage, and resistance to the same institutional pressure Diana had faced. Charles pointed to the words, Diana's royal successor, and held his voice steady. "You do not inherit her name because you suffered inside this family," he said. The sentence landed hard. Meghan answered that she was not claiming Diana's identity. She was continuing the same fight against public cruelty, isolation, and a system that protected itself before it protected vulnerable women. The monarch's restraint began to break. When Meghan said the monarchy had repeated the mistakes it made with Diana, he pushed back with anger he could no longer hide. He accused her of turning private pain into a weapon whenever she wanted access, security, influence, or sympathy. She told him that the palace called every challenge manipulation because it feared losing control. Meghan slid the request back across the table. She refused to remove the title unless the palace agreed to discuss her conditions. Charles did not sit down again. He closed the folder, placed one hand over it, and declared the meeting finished. Then Meghan revealed the part he had not expected. A public version of the proposal had already been prepared. If negotiations failed, the forbidden title could appear beyond palace control, attached to her return campaign and Diana's name. Charles warned her that any public use would trigger a formal royal response. Such a response was an official statement carrying the authority of the sovereign. It would deny any connection between Meghan's status and Diana's legacy, leaving no room for private interpretation. The king opened the door and stepped aside. The negotiation was over. But William was waiting outside, and he had no intention of allowing Meghan to leave without hearing what Diana's eldest son believed she had done. Charles had ended the negotiation.
For minutes ago, a single sealed envelope reached a king's private study and unraveled a silence that had lasted 11 years. King Edmund had spent over a decade making sure one name never returned to official palace business. Not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but because that name belonged to a woman the crown had already grieved, and grief, once settled, was not supposed to be reopened by anyone still living. Yet on this particular afternoon, a letter arrived bearing a phrase the king had personally forbidden years earlier, and the moment his eyes reached it, everything in the room changed. The letter came from Duchess Elena, wife of the king's younger son, Prince Julian. She had once been part of the working royal family before she and Julian stepped back from official duties, choosing a quieter life far from the palace's daily rhythms. Now she was asking to return, but not in the way anyone expected. She had signed her request using a phrase reserved for one person alone. The late Queen Seraphina, Julian's mother, a woman whose compassion had defined an entire era of the monarchy before her death shook the nation to its core. Elena had called herself, in writing, Seraphina's rightful successor. King Edmund set the letter down slowly. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, and placed them beside the page as if putting distance between himself and the words might soften their weight. It did not. He asked his private secretary a single question: who had allowed this letter past the household office without warning him first? The secretary had no answer, and in that gap of silence, the king understood that whatever was happening had already moved beyond his control. To understand why 5 words could ignite this kind of fury inside a king who had spent years cultivating calm, you have to understand what Queen Seraphina meant to the institution she left behind. She was not simply beloved. She was, in the eyes of millions, the human face of a monarchy that often felt distant and ceremonial. She visited hospices personally. She sat with dying patients when protocol suggested a wave from a car window would suffice. She spoke about loneliness, about mental health, about grief, at a time when royals were expected to stay silent on anything resembling vulnerability. When she died, the outpouring of public mourning did not just honor a woman, it elevated her into something closer to myth. That myth is precisely what King Edmund had spent years protecting from becoming a bargaining chip. Historians and royal biographers have long noted that monarchies guard the legacies of beloved figures with a kind of institutional anxiety, aware that public affection, once attached to a symbol, can be redirected, borrowed, or exploited by anyone clever enough to invoke it. Edmund had watched palace officials debate, quietly and repeatedly, how to prevent Seraphina's name from becoming a tool in family disputes. The rule had been simple and absolute. No living member of the family would ever be described, officially or informally, as her successor. Not his elder son, not Julian, not anyone who married into the family. The moment that rule was broken in writing by someone requesting a formal return to royal life, it stopped being a matter of etiquette and became, in the king's mind, a direct challenge to the boundary he had drawn around his late wife's memory. Prince Alexander, the heir and Julian's older brother, learned of the letter within the hour. He had grown up watching his mother's public image swell into something larger than the woman he actually remembered, the one who sat on the edge of his bed reading to him when he was small, who cried during his school recitals, who once missed an official engagement because she refused to leave his side during a fever. To Alexander, Seraphina was not primarily a symbol. She was his mother, and the idea that anyone, including his own sister-in-law, might use her name as leverage in a negotiation over titles and privileges struck him as something close to sacrilege. Alexander closed himself in his office for nearly 20 minutes before requesting a private conversation with the king. When they spoke, Edmund found his son unusually still, unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that royal aides had learned to read as barely restrained anger rather than composure. Alexander did not ask for permission to weigh in. He informed his father that no formal response should be drafted until he had a chance to address the matter directly with Elena and, if necessary, with Julian. What made the situation more delicate was the substance of Elena's request. It was not a simple gesture, a nostalgic nod to a woman she had never met, but clearly admired from a distance. It was a structured proposal. She asked to be reinstated as a working member of the family. She asked for access to a country residence long associated with Seraphina's charitable retreats. She requested a public engagement standing beside senior royals, framed explicitly as a continuation of Seraphina's humanitarian work with terminally ill children. And she asked for restored security arrangements befitting that status. Each individual request might have seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, wrapped around Seraphina's invoked name, they formed something the palace could not easily dismiss without appearing to reject compassion itself, and could not easily grant without appearing to auction off a dead woman's legacy. According to people close to the family's inner circle, Cited by royal biographers who have covered the monarchy's internal culture for decades, the forbidden phrase had actually surfaced once before, months earlier, during a private planning meeting for a charitable initiative connected to Serafina's memory. Elena had proposed her own involvement in that meeting, believing her history with pediatric hospice volunteering made her a natural fit. She was told plainly, without much room for negotiation, that she would never be presented in an official capacity as continuing Serafina's specific legacy. The refusal, according to those familiar with the meeting, was calm but unambiguous. It appears to have planted the seed for what would become, months later, a far more explicit and far more public confrontation. Elena's perspective, as she later explained to those close to her, was never rooted in ambition for its own sake. She had experienced her own version of public scrutiny after marrying into the family, criticism that at times mirrored what Serafina endured decades earlier. Intrusive coverage, unflattering comparisons, and a sense that no matter what she did, she would never be considered a natural fit. To Elena, invoking Serafina's name was not theft. It was recognition of a shared experience, an attempt to say that the pain she had lived through connected her to a woman the public already understood and already loved. But King Edmund heard something colder in that reasoning. To him, an attempt to translate personal suffering into inherited authority was not an act of solidarity. It was a category error, one that treated grief as currency and memory as something transferable. He believed, and reportedly told his private secretary as much, that suffering inside a family does not entitle anyone to claim the identity of someone who suffered before them. Those are two different things, he said, and conflating them cheapens both. When Alexander finally confronted Elena directly, the meeting took place away from cameras, away from advisors, in a private sitting room usually reserved for informal family conversations. He did not raise his voice. Those who later described the exchange noted that his restraint made the moment more unsettling, not less. He told her plainly that no living member of the family, regardless of the pain they carried, would be presented publicly as his mother's successor. Elena pushed back, arguing that she was not claiming Serafina's identity, only continuing her humanitarian direction. Alexander did not dispute her sincerity. He disputed her conclusion. Grief, he told her, can create understanding. It cannot create a title. Prince Julian occupied the most difficult position of all. He understood, more intimately than his brother, why his wife felt the comparison so strongly, because he had watched her endure years of public criticism that echoed, in painful ways, what his own mother had faced. But he also knew how deeply his brother reacted whenever their mother's name entered a negotiation, and he feared that defending his wife too forcefully might be read, inside a family already strained by years of distance, as betraying the very woman both sons had spent their lives trying to protect. For several tense days, the matter sat unresolved. Palace officials, according to those familiar with internal communications, prepared contingency language in case the dispute became public, aware that any leaked detail involving Serafina's name would dominate headlines regardless of how carefully it was managed. Edmund, meanwhile, authorized a formal, if quiet, restriction. No future correspondence, negotiation, or ceremonial description involving Elena could reference Serafina as a predecessor model or inspiration in any official capacity. It was not vindictive. It was, in his words to close advisors, a boundary the family needed in order to keep moving forward without turning a mother's memory into a permanent battlefield. The resolution, when it came, arrived not through royal decree, but through a private conversation between Julian and Elena, away from advisors and away from the pressure of palace protocol. Julian told her, gently but firmly, that defending her did not require accepting that she had become his mother's successor. He reminded her that Serafina had been his mother before she became a symbol borrowed by supporters, critics, and institutions alike, and that he could no longer watch her name used as a justification in disputes that had little to do with her actual legacy. Elena, by her own later account, admitted something she had resisted saying aloud, that part of her desire to return stemmed not from a genuine continuation of Serafina's mission, but from a need to prove that stepping back from royal life years earlier had not diminished her own significance. It was a difficult admission, and Julian did not treat it as a victory. He simply held her hand as the tension between them settled into something quieter and more honest. Elena ultimately withdrew her request, choosing instead to pursue her charitable interests independently, without invoking Serafina's name or seeking official reinstatement. King Edmund, for his part, chose not to escalate the matter publicly, understanding that a harsher response risked transforming a private disagreement into exactly the kind of public spectacle he had hoped to avoid. He closed the file quietly, instructing that Serafina's name be removed from any documentation connected to the failed negotiation, and made clear, through a brief private acknowledgement to his sons, that the matter was considered settled. What remains from this episode is not a villain and a victim, but a family still learning, more than a decade later, how to hold a shared loss without letting it become a weapon. Serafina's legacy did not belong to Elena, to Alexander, to Julian, or even to the crown itself. It lived, as those who remembered her best understood, in the people she had helped and in the sons who still carried her absence with them every day. No title, however carefully worded, could inherit that. And in the end, that was the quiet truth the whole family had to relearn together. Some legacies are not meant to be passed down. They are simply meant to be remembered.